Chapter 19. I've got plenty to learn. His camp was pitched in a snug spot near the mouth of the Woolooman Creek, sheltered from storm winds by a rocky spur, a cool spot in summer, warm in winter, and well above the reach of sudden floods. It was on an easy level, nicely drained. His bunk would be dry, no sleeping over sodden ground. That would mean discomfort and maybe fever and rheumatism. There was something clean and efficient about that neat little camp, all that a man required, yet easy to pack up quickly. The same applied to his working and cooking tools. Well cared for, light to handle, all that was needed, yet nothing cumbersome. Certainly no lumber of any sort. His saddlery, sheltered from weather, was in apple pie order. This man could pack up and move off at a moment's notice. Though I did not notice this all at once. From across the river somewhere came the tinkle of a hoarse bell. He nodded in a satisfied way. "My horses," he said simply, "a riding and a pack." "Is that all you need?" I asked doubtfully. "Yes, I can travel anywhere with 1,000 miles if necessary. As a rule, unless I'm moving a camp, I only use the pack. It's easier in rough country, and especially in scrub. I don't mind walking. I do a lot of prospecting on foot, though simply carry a few days' tucker." We camped there that night in the tent, for it was a bit chilly. While spreading the blanket, I commandeered from the tent side a couple of neatly folded bags for extra nap. Under the bags was a neat 4-foot length of tin trough, very similar to a short length of roof guttering. What caught my eye, though, was that one end of it was neatly closed in like a sluice box. Under the hurricane lamp, the bottom gleamed bright and shiny as if worn smooth, like the bottom of a well-kept, constantly used streaming box. Lying it was a flat piece of tin shaped just like, and not much larger than a playing card. "Sorry," I said, "didn't know you had anything under the bags." "It's all right," he replied quietly. "What do you think it is?" "Blessed if I know," I replied doubtfully, "unless it's a toy sluice box you've made for some youngster in Herberton." "It is a sluice box," he said. "I stream all my tin in it." Sitting cross-legged on his bunk and hand-cupping his chin, pipe between lips, with not a flicker on his face, he seemed quietly enjoying my disbelief. "Fact," he went on, "I stream all my concentrates in that box, as quickly and cleanly, perhaps more so than you could with a heavy 12-foot wooden box and shovel. Also, I can carry it anywhere, any distance, and a bag of tin with it as well, if need be. Can put it anywhere, creek bank, terrace, ridge top. To run a race into it, I've only to dam up the creek water with a couple of handfuls of sand. Then again, a mere trickle will work this box, where the usual box would be hopeless if distant from water. I merely scratch a race to this little beauty with the pick," or he nodded gravely, "with the streaming shovel." And I stared down at the little oblong of tin lying in the box. "When I travel," he resumed, and did not even smile, "you can see that the box is no weight for the horse to carry." Blessed if I knew whether he was joking or not. Those tight-closed lips, that clean-cut face, Wore no telltale expression at all. "I'll show you in the morning," he said, "then you'll see it can be done." Laying down the pipe, he pulled off his boots and lay back in his bunk, hands clasped behind head. I rolled into my blanket on the floor. I work my claims a little differently also. Presently came the voice from the bunk. "Never bother with dry ground unless, as happens very seldom, I wish to be near a town for a few months. Always work ground with or very close to running water, which is power. Choose the shallowest ground. Never work deep. And even then pick the eyes out of it, prospect it, and only work those little patches here and there that carry good, payable ground. Then pack up and look for another claim. That means you never waste time and labor working dead ground," I said haltingly, "but you'd never find a deep lead that way." "I don't want to," he answered simply, but I protested. "On one of these prospecting trips, when you're roaming around, you might drop on a rich claim, a good-sized claim, rich through and through. You'd have to settle down and work it then." "No, I wouldn't. I work it until I get tired of it, then sell out, pack up, and look for another. There are thousands of square miles of country still to be gone over here. There will be mineral still left in these ranges 100 years from now." He reached up and blew out the hurricane lamp. I lay there in the darkness thinking. It seemed for hours. Thinking is the hardest work, but here was something to think about: how to make an independent living without being a working bullock, as Jim Bell called it. When I thought of all the dead work that Jim and Mick and old Brooks and Tommy Turley and I and many others bullocked through, and down there in the darkness of the earth too. When I thought of the box we used, it took 2 men to carry it a few yards. When I thought of the sluice races we had to dig, of the heavy tools we used, of the often scarce, precious water we were so dependent on. But I had a very great deal to learn about tin mining yet. However, in years fast coming, what I did learn from this strange man was to save me incalculable labor, and especially in gold mining. Birds were still squawking their joy of sunrise when we were plodding on up the divide. Bird life in fascinating variety enlivened all those great tablelands. Steadily we climbed well out from the rocky banks of that now so dry river. I was following the jungle man, though this was lightly timbered forest country with rugged outlines softened under early morning sunlight. Soon the lightening shadows, still lingering in gorge and ravine, would reflect bright sunlight from gray, hot granite walls. Then dreamy coolness would give way to heat, the busy calling of birds gradually quieten to the hushed restfulness of midday. It was glorious, this steady walking on and up past rock and tree, over fallen branch and coarse grass, where man as yet had made no track. Ever ahead, bold hilltops reached challengingly up to right and left. The steep fall away of rocky ravines fairly shouted to the prospector an invitation to try their shaded, mysterious depths. I was eager to do so, but glancing at the ever-advancing back of my now quiet mate, I instinctively hesitated to call out, "Shall we try this one?" By the end of several days' tramping, I realized he had no intention of trying. This little trip was merely to try me out, though he was carrying the prospecting tools that had interested me so much. As we climbed higher and the way grew rougher, my eyes were watching the ground and continually rising to that little pick slung so easily at the back of his belt. It was no weight to carry and was not in his way. He could reach behind and whip it out at any moment, and yet we walked over reef after reef, and he never napped an outcrop once. Any prospecting I had done so far was with a heavy, cumbersome 5-pound pick, with a thick handle nearly 3 feet long. His slender handle was only a foot long. That toy pick and handle combined would not weigh 2 pounds. There was something else. One end of the pick had been cut off and fashioned by the forge into a hammer head, a napping hammer, he had explained, for napping a sample of rock from a reef. Any napping hammer I'd yet seen had been several pounds in weight, and quite separate from a pick. The other end of his pick was as delicately shaped as the beak of a crane, but slightly curved. I was to find that it was efficient for its work as the beak of a bird is to its job, and tempered to an amazing strength for digging out a sample anywhere, he had said simply, on hillside, gully, or river, particularly good for crevice raking. Only experience was to teach me how efficient it was. Up above his belt, his pack swag rested easily over the sturdy shoulders. In a pocket on that pack was the prospecting dish. I could not believe it. The usual large, wide, deep prospecting dish would hold a dozen such as this, dozens, should they be stacked together. A prospecting dish would hold 10, 15, 20 pounds of washed dirt. This dish would barely hold a pound. This dish was a baby, a small baby frying pan, with the handle cut off. We could and did use it also as a frying pan when we needed to. Why carry heavy weights of earth, often long distances, to water, he had asked the evening before, when a few handfuls, if selected from the most promising ground, will do as well. When you're prospecting away from established workings, 10 in this district must be fairly rich to pay. If you cannot root out wash dirt that will show a payable result for the quantity of dirt you can put into this frying pan, then it is not payable. Not to me, anyway. As a matter of fact, he had added, when bush prospecting, I rarely bother to use it. If I cannot see 10, whether dry or wet, then the ground is not good enough for me to waste time over. Seeing my complete mystification, he had almost smiled. I'll show you one of these days how it's done, if we take a trip or two together. I use this dish mainly for gold. At that magical word I was all ears, luckily, because too much tongue would have spoilt everything. In a dreamy sort of way, the evening before, he had spoken of gold, of silent prospectors, of hidden gullies, of mullocky leaders heavily studded with golden plums, until well into the night. And now the sun was blazing from a cloudless sky, and he was climbing on just ahead, seemingly quite without effort, and also without a sign of showing me one prospecting secret, or how to use those baby tools I still could not quite believe in. How burdensome the usual dish and pick, let alone a shovel, would have become by now. I knew well how they seemed to grow weightier with each mile, just as a man's iron-shod boots would drag over the long, rough miles. I wiped a sweaty forehead with the back of my hand, staring again at that moving back, those long legs just ahead, so efficient effortlessly, carrying not only prospecting tools but swag, blanket, and tucker. All this man claimed for his methods and equipment he would prove true during other trips. In years fast coming, the knowledge I gained from him was to mean never riches, but an independent living for me, and one regret that through stupidity or the exuberant carelessness of youth I had not learnt ever so much more from my strange mate. A brazen sun had passed just overhead when he called a halt, merely by turning around. As I came up to him he inquired, "Boil the billy?" "You bet, but where's water?" "Up here on top of the world." He merely glanced down by his right, and there, under the lip of a gully head, in a hole in a big flat rock, gleamed a tiny pool. Cool nectar. Not until I had thirstily drunk did I notice the water was seeping from a spring in the bank. "You've been this way before," I called up. He merely nodded. Bending, he already had lit a fire. I filled the billy and put it on. The sun-dried sticks, crackling briskly, were already at fierce heat. This man knew how to prepare a fire. He was gazing back. "Which way would you say Herberton lies?" he asked musingly. I turned around, stretched out an arm, and opened the big mouth, then abruptly shut it. Behind us stretched a vista of descending hill crests, gullies and ravines, far as the eye could see, a serrated maze of broken country going on, but the gullies, only partly visible here and there among the ridges, surely seemed to be running in the wrong direction. Hastily I squinted towards the sun. Even the dashed sun seemed to be traveling wrong, walking light-heartedly behind this man. I had failed to register direction. Warily now I noted the direction of my shadow, then turned again to gaze back over that country. The silent devil must have taken a sharp turn when coming to that spring. Just to confuse me, he had. It took quite some moments to trace where those seemingly criss-crossing gullies must drop down into the dry river, then carefully follow the lie of the country, where the river would twist and turn on, its fall for miles and miles among those ridges to join, far away down there, with the wild river, then follow the wild river to Herberton. Slowly turning, I stretched out an arm. "About there." "Not bad," he murmured, and, turning to the fire, dropped in the tea and lifted off the billy. To hell with you, I thought. Chapter 20. My Strange Mate. Whore billy tea without milk. The simplest of meals, sauced by ravenous appetite, purest air carrying a lingering whisper, the tang of trees surfeited with sunlight taking their midday doze, insects busy in their struggle for survival, in their great forest, the stunted bushes and warm grass tufts. I leant back against a rock. There were rocks everywhere. Lazily taking out the pipe. Yes, it was good to be alive. Curiously enough, in the clearest of skies, 3 big white fleecy clouds were majestically sailing just overhead, one following the other, slowly changing shape. 3 old-time ships, I thought, quietly taking in sail, maneuvering for a cozy anchorage in the coral sea. And if the waters are bluer than the sky, then I'm a Dutchman. He was slowly filling his pipe, gazing away out over distance. I remember idly thinking he might be a much stronger bloke than he looked. He was built for endurance, anyway. A few cheeky birds, despite the wildness here and the heat, were twittering nearby, hopping gradually closer, cautious yet clearly expectant. I glanced round, feeling mean. We had not cast aside a crumb. "Oh well, remember, next time," came a murmuring voice. He was filling his pipe. I gaped at him. "I was dreaming," I said uncertainly. "I didn't quite catch what you said." "You felt nice and sorry about the birds," he replied quietly. "You were thinking we were greedy pigs. Oh well, we won't disappoint them." Coolly he threw them a couple of crusts of damper. He'd kept those crusts out of sight behind him. It was days later before I became firmly convinced that this cunning devil had deliberately tested me to learn whether I felt kindly toward birds. He had lit his pipe and got it going well. Eyes half closed, I waited for him to say something. "Better be going," he said quietly. "It'll be rough going before we make camp." He reached for the billy, tipped out the leaves, hung the billy on his pack swag, slipped it over his shoulders, and seemed to be standing up in the one movement, surprised and disappointed at having been done out of a midday smoke and yarn. I slung the swag too. The birds hopped warily aside, the greedy ones protesting. He faced south and pointed almost west, Mount Misery. He nodded vaguely towards hill crests that might have been leftovers from the moon. Deserves its name, too. Woolooman Creek heads near there. We'll soon be up on the divide now. A bit of rough country before that, though. He started off. That bit of rough country was rough, just a sea of ravines, nature's deep scoured furrows of millions of years of wear and tear. A man with a careless foot could easily break his neck here, let alone a leg. I took care not to, with a wary eye now on direction. But there the curious thought had struck me how easily this man could slip a man up. Back there, where he had tried to bamboozle me as to the direction of Herberton. From there I would have had enough bush sense to have found my way back. It would be much more difficult now. If a man were a new chum and had a row with this man, why, he could simply disappear. In a case like that, an inexperienced man, in this deceptive and terrifyingly rough country, nearly waterless as it now was, would probably panic within a few hours. I began wondering yet again at my strange mate, while carefully now memorizing direction. Steadily he climbed on, and down, and up again, and never once suggested we try this fascinating country all around us. The rocks, the reefs, the deeply scoured ravines were simply crying out of minerals, perhaps gold, and he was to have shown me. I realize now that was only the impression, how to prospect even without water. Surely he must be making for some even better-looking country farther ahead. Suddenly he turned with a warning finger to lips. Motionless, I watched his finger point down towards his feet, then back slowly out across the bush. His finger traced a wallaby pad, leading faintly yet distinctly through the grass, then over bare rock into grass again, such a constantly used pad as undisturbed wallabies make to and from a watering place or favorite shelter. Motionless we stood, plain now the murmur of the bush, only the faintest whispering of air currents, rising up from the ravines, faint hum of insect life, screech of a parrot, Distantly then, but distinctly, a soft thud, thud. In amazement, I realized this man had heard the wallaby moments before, and even while he was walking, came that thud, thud again, a little closer. I could picture that lazily contented wallaby, daydreaming as he came leisurely hopping along. I grinned at the silly thought that he might have a meet on with a girlfriend. His ears had appeared, his forepaws, then the little hunched-up body slowly hopping towards us amongst the tall, coarse grass tufts. He came hopping to within 6 feet of my mate, who hissed loudly. That wallaby's forepaws hit out as if warding off a blow. He jerked back upright on his tail, his whole body swaying agitatedly, prick ears outstretched and twitching to every air current, his nostrils dilated and sniffing, his eyes big with fright. He simply did not see us. He was staring straight at my mate. Then his pretty head jerked towards me. I thought he was going to fall back over his tail as he sniffed agitatedly to locate the very danger his dilated eyes were staring at. We were dressed in gray flannel and gray dungaree trousers, like the gray granite rocks, faces, arms, chest, sunburnt like the sun-baked earth, and we stood utterly motionless. The shock was so unexpected, he seemed to have lost power either to see or smell us. My mate said hello, and the wallaby's head jerked back to the sound. Then it plunged uncontrollably forward, straight against my mate, bounding sideways, struck a rock, bounded aside again, and was away down a gully in frantic leaps that I thought would break its neck at any moment. At that volley of sound, of swishing bushes and stones rolling down into the gully, I broke into a peal of laughter, and my smart mate, who must have had the wind pretty well knocked out of him, laughed too, a quiet laugh, but the first one I'd heard from him. Still laughing, I squatted on a handy rock and pulled out the pipe. "This is worth a smoke, oh," I chuckled. "Best laugh I've had since I put the billy goat in old Mick's bed." With a bit of a smile, he sat down and pulled out the pipe. "Yes, that wallaby got a shock," he said casually, as did Mick when he woke up to find the old billy goat breathing across his face. A worse shock, though, was a joke that gave Paddy Garland the fright of his life a few years back. Paddy was a cedar-getter on his way to Cairns for a spree. He put up at the Riverstone Hotel one night about 15 miles out of Cairns. Paddy had the local reputation of being a great joker. So had a character he met at the pub, a wandering sort of cove who'd taken on a job collecting native curios for Baron von Mueller the naturalist. He'd come in from the scrubs the same night with natives carrying a load of curios he was going to ship from Cairns. He and Paddy chummed up right away. They had a lot in common. They played jokes half through the night, got hilariously drunk together. Paddy staggered away to bed in the small hours. He awoke at sunrise, hazily aware of an awful smell. He groped out with an arm and found a man in bed beside him. The sleeper felt as hard and cold as iron, but as Paddy just then could only feel his own head, it took him quite a time to realize this. Indignantly, he threw off the blanket and roared at his bedmate, then nearly bit off his tongue with a yell that woke the hotel. He was out of bed and the window in one bound. You see, the sleeper beside him was an aboriginal mummy, somewhat beetle-eaten and atrociously smellful. Good heavens, how on earth did it get there? Paddy's boozing partner of the night before put it there, of course. It was the prize of his collection for von Mueller. He thought it would be a great joke to slip it into the bed of his fellow joker. What a beastly joke! Maybe that's what old Mick thought, he said slyly. At least old Mick woke up to find a live billy goat sleeping beside him, but your cedar getter found a dead blackfellow. Yes, he admitted, a lively difference indeed, and blew a smoke ring to encircle an inquisitive March fly. I've never heard of the aboriginals mummifying their dead, I said doubtfully. I've only met 2 tribes who do, away farther north. It is more common. It is only a very rough mummification anyway. They actually only smoke dry them in a hollow tree. Anyway, how on earth did you hear that wallaby all that distance away? Why, it must have been minutes before he came along. He was hopping slowly and softly too, and he came from away down to the left side of us, and you were walking ahead at the time. I've got pretty good ears, he puffed, and you use them too. Why, you must be able to hear even an aboriginal's footsteps. Not quite, he replied, not unless he was walking carelessly. I thought I was pretty good. I've done a lot of wallaby hunting among the hills around Broken Hill, but you can beat me by miles. He was pleased, for he quietly told me things about animals until our pipes smoked out. I could have listened through many pipes, for all bush lads prided themselves on knowledge of animals. All too soon we were walking on again. Barely half an hour later he turned round with the same warning signal. From a patch of stunted forest we had stepped out onto a gully head that fell precipitously before us. Abrupt ridge tops, scarred by gully heads and crowned by stunted timber, stretched on up to the divide. He stood leaning forward, left hand resting on the side of a granite boulder, nearly as big as a house. He put his cheek to the boulder that, half embedded in the earth, sloped out over the gully side. He turned and beckoned with a sign of extreme caution. When I crept down to his side, he whispered, "Do you smell anything?" I sniffed the air carefully. "No, only the bush." "Put your cheek to the rock and smell again." I leant to the hot rock, smelling all I knew how, but there came only the granity sense of the rock, the faint tang of vegetation warmed by heat. I straightened up, shook my head wonderingly. The faintest expression of satisfaction seemed to flit across his face as he whispered in my ear, "Creep down along the side of the rock ever so carefully. Turn with it, creep along it. If you are quite noiseless, you may see something." With the hunter in every youth aroused in me, and intensely curious, inch by inch I crept down along the side of the boulder. Hardly breathing, I began to move round it. It sloped overhead now like a veranda over the steep gully bank, throwing a cool shadow upon the coarse grass at its base. Though now I was staring straight along the base of the rock and could plainly see the markings on the granite, see every tuft of grass, the few dead twigs, every pebble in the cool shade cast by that overhanging boulder. Still I could see nothing. Inch by inch I crept along. Then in a flash froze to the granite, as there stood erect, not 6 feet away, a full-grown dingo, sniffing nose straight at me, ears pricked, eyes not wide like the wallaby's, but half closed as its nostrils wrinkled in intense concentration. I could see the bristles twitching and feeling around as if each were a live thing. Like the wallaby, it could see me, but as yet its startled instinct could not register the fact. Every ginger hair on its taut body seemed standing erect in questioning alarm. Gradually, its green eyes widened, glaring up into mine. It simply must be smelling me now. Surely. It could even see the movement of my breathing as I crouched frozen to the granite. For long moments we stood staring thus at one another. I could hear birds whistling with a clear distinctiveness, hear the hum of insects, seemed to see every hair on the taut red body as its sharply cut, suspicious muzzle sniffed up at me. Then I smelt it so distinctly. He has lit his pipe, and in a flash the dingo had wheeled round and vanished down the bank. And in another moment the jungle man stood beside me. "A dingo," I said. He was sound asleep under the rock. He smelt your tobacco smoke. A cozy posy for a warm afternoon siesta. "How on earth did you know it was there?" I asked. "Smelt it," he replied simply. "Smelt it from away back there," I said unbelievingly. "Farther than that," he answered, but this was so simple. With the pipe stem he pointed to the gully head. "As you know," he explained in that casual tone of his, "heat and atmospheric conditions draw up air from the valleys. I did not know, not then. From the valleys it seeps up into the creeks, then the gullies, comes creeping up the ravines. Here is the gully head where it seeps over, overflows as a flooded river does, its banks. That air current breathed up against this big rock face, crept round its corners, then up along its sides, from where my nostrils got a whiff away back there. Such air currents, as they creep along over the earth, carry the scent of animal with it, any animal or man that the current just there passes over, and that's that." Gazing at him, I pulled out the pipe and sat down. "I'm learning things," I said. "Stone the crows, then you can smell distant animals as well as hear them." "If conditions are favorable," he answered, "but I can hear a long way farther." "Well, I wish I could do the same," I said admiringly, and meant it. He sat down. I'd said the right thing again. I could smoke my pipe out now. "Well then," he said calmly, and nodded towards the rock. "Go and smell where the dingo was lying. You'll register the tang of it then." Not overwillingly, I did so. I'd smelt animal dens before, and was not keen on the perfume. "I can smell him now," I called. "That is, where he was lying down." "Right. Get a good whiff of him, but don't linger too long. If you get a dingo tick on you, you'll know all about it." I was up and away from that spot almost as fast as the dingo had gone. It was through poking about in kangaroo caves that I had learnt very agitatedly of the kangaroo tick, and their hideous things. "That's queer," I said, nodding over the pipe stem. "What you just told me about air currents." Dreamy-voiced, he told me other queer things then, about air in the valley and mountain top, in forest and jungle, in heat and cold and wet, and scents from flowering trees in forest and scrub, and of lovely elusive perfume lingering in the jungle from some scented bark or hidden flower, or, strangest of all, from some poisonous phosphorescent fungus. In no time the pipe was smoked out, and he was standing up there, slinging the swag over his shoulders. That night we camped almost atop of the divide. As usual, seemingly by instinct, he'd walked straight to a snug spot, a wee spring handy, a grassy hollow cozily sheltered from wind. The earth would remain warm for quite a while here, for the hollow had collected concentrated sunlight throughout the day. Nights can be bitter cold in that area, and we only had one blanket each. With a rock face at our back and a cheery fire, down in this snug hollow we were warm enough. I noticed he did not waste wood, though there was a forest of it all around us. But his fires were not like the wary blackfellow's fire. They were always cheery and seemed to throw out just the right heat, and he chose wood that always lasted until well on into the small hours. It was always I who shiveringly awoke, then to make the fire up again. He would have lain there without sound or movement until daylight otherwise, plodding along that afternoon. We had been silent ever since seeing the dingo, and now each was lying on his blanket within the warmth of the fire, smoking and gazing up at that everlasting wonder of the stars. But for the cheery fire, the night seemed as silent as they. "Do you ever think there may be men up there?" I ventured at last. "Why not?" I don't know. Never been up there." "You can easily do so." "How?" "Imagination. Pick out any star. Imagine you are there, and you are there." "Imagination travels faster than the speed of light." There was no imagination in that dingo smell this afternoon. That is only because it is earthy like we are. I'm a bit puzzled why you suggested I smell it and register, so that you would know a dingo scent again, and if at every chance you smelt one, or any animal, and were always alert to air currents, your nostrils would begin to register. Your sense of smell would gradually wake up. You would begin to smell the presence of an animal, and identify it farther and farther away. Same goes for hearing and sight too, and other things. Instinct and intuition, for instance." Is that how you learnt?" "Mainly yes, though as a very young boy I noticed at times I seemed to know things better or sooner than grown-ups. Saying nothing to anybody, I began to develop these senses. I soon could smell my own father when he was angry. That is why he could never find me when he was coming to give me a hiding for doing something he did not understand. Covertly I glanced towards him, lying there with hands cupped behind his head. He was smoking up at the stars, firelight bathing his serious face with an expression of quiet serenity. He could be a likable chap if he wanted to, and would only smile a bit more, but there was that cold gray look in his eyes. I turned back to the stars again. "Have you ever been a primitive man?" the quiet voice inquired. "Why, no, of course not," I replied in surprise. "Yes, you have, as truly as those stars are above. You carry countless cells in your body that come from your most primitive ancestors, and, to come nearer home, from those who lived only a few thousand years ago. Even then, most men's lives depended on their primitive senses and abilities, which after all are the same as those we are made up of today. Eyesight, hearing, reasoning, acuteness of smell, touch, speed, instinct, endurance. You've inherited a fair endurance, which your fathers must have had before you, and ever since you were a toddler, as you've told me, you've knocked about the bush a lot, been keen on hunting and bird life, which to the bloodthirsty youngster means long walks and tree climbing and all the rest of it. And since boyhood you've been kept fit by physical work, and I notice you've kept jogging along pretty well since we started out from Nigger Creek, but your senses of sight and hearing are now only moderate, while those of touch and smell are nearly dormant. As for wariness and intuition, you've simply never used them, but they're only rusty, they're still there. This reasoning was getting beyond me. I turned back to the stars. They seemed a bit closer net somehow. Well then, I said after a pause, by now you must have the sense of sight and hearing and smell developed as keenly as an aboriginal. Not quite, he replied. Remember, the wild aboriginal is born to his primitive senses. Above all, he lives in the environment and is trained from babyhood to use those senses. But you said you trained yourself from near babyhood. Yes, but I had no one to train me. In the silence, for the first time in life, I vaguely began to realize what such early training might mean. Presently he said, among aboriginals, as among all men, there are degrees of knowing. Some are better than others. I have proved I am as good as some of those others. Quite often, too, especially in the big scrubs, I've smelled aboriginals before they've smelled me. In time, soon coming, I was able to believe this from my own experience of aborigines, only because, of course, of their habit of smearing their bodies with rancid oils, and worse, though my aboriginal friends with the disgusted sniff swore they could smell me or any white man a mile or more away. However, on plenty of occasions I was to prove them wrong, or else they were just mooning along dreaming, as we do.